Uber pulled into my driveway at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, 3 days before I was supposed to be home. I remember the exact time because I checked my phone right before I opened the car door. Force of habit. 41 years working in logistics will do that to you. You track time the way other people track breathing. The house was dark. That part didn't surprise me. My wife Helen has trouble sleeping when I'm away. She usually takes her medication around 9 and is out by 10. What did surprise me was the side door, the one that leads from the garage into the kitchen, hanging open about 2 inches. Not all the way open. Just enough that the cold November air was getting in. Helen never leaves that door open. She grew up in Winnipeg. She has a deeply personal relationship with keeping the cold out. I stood in the garage for a moment, suitcase still in my hand, and listened. Nothing. No TV. No radio. She sometimes leaves on for company. Just the hum of the refrigerator through the wall and the wind doing what wind does in Sudbury in November. I called her name before I went inside. Then again once I was in the kitchen. The light above the stove was the only thing on, the way we always leave it. I set my bag down and walked toward the hallway, and that's when I noticed the glass on the counter. One glass. Bone dry. A thin, white residue around the inside rim, like something had dried in it hours ago. I found Helen in the bedroom, half covered by the duvet, her lips cracked and her skin so dry it looked like paper. She was breathing, but when I touched her shoulder, it took her a long time to open her eyes. "Roy," she said, "just my name, nothing else." I called 911 before I even turned on the bedside lamp. The paramedics said she was severely dehydrated. One of them, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 26, told me that if I'd come home the following morning instead of that night, we would have been looking at a very different situation. She said it quietly and professionally, the way people say things when they want you to understand the gravity without completely falling apart in front of you. I understood the gravity. I rode in the ambulance with Helen and I held her hand, and I did not allow myself to think about how this had happened. Not yet. I had learned a long time ago that there is a time to feel and a time to think clearly, and if you mix the two up, you end up doing neither properly. She was admitted to Health Sciences North just after midnight. By 2 in the morning, she had an IV in her arm and some color coming back to her face, and a nurse had explained to me that her potassium was dangerously low and that she was showing signs of prolonged malnutrition, not just a missed meal or two. Days. Days. I sat in the chair beside her bed and I thought about my daughter-in-law, Pam. Let me explain how we got here. Helen had her first stroke 14 months ago. It was a mild one. The doctors called it a TIA, a transient ischemic attack, the kind that doesn't leave permanent damage but announces clearly that the body is changing. She recovered well, but her balance was off after that, and her left hand shook sometimes, and there were days when the fatigue was so heavy she couldn't get off the couch by 2 in the afternoon. She needed someone with her during the day. We both knew it. Our son Kyle had married Pam 7 years ago. Pam is a registered practical nurse. She works, or worked, at a clinic in New Sudbury. When I brought up the idea of hiring in-home support, Kyle called me before I'd even finished looking into agencies. "Dad, Pam could do this," he said. "She's qualified. She knows Mom. Mom trusts her. Why would you bring in a stranger?" It made sense. I want to be honest about that. At the time, it made complete sense. Helen did trust Pam. They'd always gotten along. Saturday lunches, garden planning, the kind of daughter-in-law relationship I knew a lot of men my age didn't have and felt lucky for. We agreed on a rate. I won't say the exact number, but it was fair, more than fair actually, because she was family and I wanted her to feel valued. She would come every weekday morning, make sure Helen had breakfast and her medications, check in at lunch and stay until 4. Evenings and weekends, a neighbor, a retired teacher named Gloria, had agreed to pop by. For the first few months it seemed to work. Helen seemed stable. When I called home, she sounded like herself. Pam would text me updates. "Good day today. Ate a full lunch, resting comfortably. I travel for work. I consult now, after retiring from my company, mostly contract reviews and supply chain audits for manufacturers in Ontario. The trip I just cut short was supposed to be 8 days in Thunder Bay, working with a paper mill on a distribution contract. 3 days in, my client called a halt. Internal restructuring. They needed 2 weeks to sort out which division was even handling the project. They apologized and told me they'd cover the hotel for the night, but that I should head home. I booked an Uber instead of calling Kyle because it was late and I didn't want to bother anyone. That decision, that small, considerate, boring decision, is probably the reason my wife is still alive. In the hospital, once Helen was stable and sleeping, I started going back through the texts Pam had sent over the past week. Quiet day, resting, good. The messages were fine, short but fine. Except when I looked at the timestamps, every single one had been sent between 8 and 9 in the morning. Nothing after that. I hadn't noticed because I'd been in back-to-back meetings and I'd glanced at them and moved on. 8 in the morning, then nothing. I called Kyle at 6 a.m. It rang several times and went to voicemail. I texted. No response. I thought maybe he was sleeping. He works shifts at the mine and sometimes he's dead to the world until noon. I left the hospital at 8, drove home, and walked through the house with my eyes open this time. Helen's medication organizer was on the kitchen table. 3 days of compartments still full, untouched. The fridge had milk, condiments, half a block of old cheddar, and a bag of apples going soft. The bread on the counter had a spot of mold on one corner. There was a single bowl in the drying rack that had been used and washed. One bowl, for however many days I'd been gone. I went to the side table where we keep a spare key and the emergency binder, the one with Helen's medical information, her care instructions, the list of her medications and dosages. It was there, but when I opened it, the care schedule page, the one I had printed out and slipped in there when Pam started, was gone. Not misplaced, gone. The plastic sleeve was empty. I called Gloria. Gloria is 71 years old, sharp as a tack, and one of those people who doesn't waste words. She told me she hadn't seen anyone at our house in at least 4 days. She said she'd knocked once, 2 days ago, because she hadn't seen the kitchen light come on, and Pam had opened the door and told her that Helen was having a rest, and that everything was fine. Gloria said something felt off about it, but she hadn't wanted to overstep. I should have called you, she said. I'm sorry, Roy. You didn't do anything wrong, I told her. I meant it. She was a neighbor doing her best. The fault was somewhere else entirely. I called the home care agency I had originally contacted before Kyle and Pam offered their alternative. I asked if they had any record of being contacted to provide service at our address. The woman I spoke to checked and came back with an interesting answer. They had been contacted, not by me, but by someone calling on my behalf, and they had been told that the family had decided to go in a different direction and that their services would not be needed. That call had come in 11 months ago. 11 months ago, I was paying Pam to take care of my wife. I put the phone down on the kitchen table and I sat there for probably 4 minutes without moving. Then I picked it up again and called the lawyer. Her name is Beverly, and she has handled our family's legal matters for the better part of 15 years. Wills, a property dispute with a neighbor in 2019, the incorporation paperwork when I set up my consulting business. She didn't seem surprised when I told her what I was putting together. What she did tell me was that I needed documentation and that I needed to be careful about how I gathered it. Don't confront anyone yet, she said. Don't let them know you know. If there's financial fraud involved alongside the neglect, you want everything buttoned up before you move. I asked her what I should be looking for. She told me to pull my bank records, check whether the transfers to Pam had continued as normal, and to contact Helen's doctor to request her full file for the past year, every visit, every note. I spent the rest of that day and the following day doing exactly that. What I found in the bank records. The e-transfers I had set up to Pam's account had gone through every 2 weeks without interruption, not one missed payment. She had continued to collect every 14 days for services she had stopped providing. What I found in Helen's medical file, the last visit to her family doctor had been nearly 5 months ago. She had missed 2 follow-up appointments after that, with no cancellation on record, meaning nobody had called to cancel. She had simply not shown up. There was a note from the doctor's office saying they had attempted to contact her twice and received no answer. The doctor's office had a contact number on file for Helen. I didn't recognize it. When I called it, I got a voicemail for Pam. She had changed the callback number on my wife's medical file to her own. Anytime Helen's doctor tried to follow up, the call went to Pam. I had to stop and stand at the kitchen sink for a few minutes after I figured that one out. I ran the cold water and I looked out at the backyard, at the snow just starting to settle on the garden Helen loves, and I let myself feel it, really feel what had been done, and then I put it away and kept going. Kyle called me back that afternoon. He sounded casual. He said he'd been sleeping, sorry he missed me. How was Thunder Bay? I told him the project got pushed back and I'd come home early. He said, "Oh, nice," in the way people say things when they're not actually processing what you've said. I asked him how his mom was doing. There was a pause. Just a small one. "But I've known my son for 34 years. She's good," he said. "Pam was just there yesterday." That was a lie. Gloria hadn't seen anyone in 4 days. The timestamps on Pam's text told me she hadn't been there since the morning of the day I'd left. I told Kyle that was great to hear, and that I was exhausted from the travel, and that I'd talk to him soon. After I hung up, I called Beverly back. I told her what I had. I told her about the changed phone number, the missed appointments, the unbroken payment record, the empty medication organizer. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Roy, this is elder financial abuse and criminal negligence, possibly more." She told me to contact the Ontario Provincial Police non-emergency line and ask to speak with someone in their financial crimes unit. She offered to make a few calls herself. I'm going to be honest, the next 10 days were some of the strangest of my life. I went about things as normally as I could manage. I visited Helen every day. She improved steadily, though the doctor told me the malnutrition had set her back considerably and that we would need to reassess her care needs significantly. I nodded and said we would. I didn't tell him what I knew yet. I'd been advised to wait. Helen asked me once, lying in her hospital bed, why she had felt so terrible. She remembered Pam coming in the morning, she said, but the afternoons had been blurry. She remembered being thirsty and not being able to get to the kitchen easily. She remembered calling out a few times and no one coming. I held her hand and told her she was safe now. She didn't press me further. She knows me well enough to know when I'm holding something back, and also well enough to trust me to handle it. The OPP detective I worked with was a woman named, I'll just say she was thorough, professional, and clearly had seen versions of this before. She explained that financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult is a criminal offense under the Criminal Code of Canada, and that the negligence component, given Helen's documented medical deterioration, opened the door to further charges. She also pulled Pam's employment records with Beverly's help and found that Pam had reduced her clinic hours to part-time 9 months ago, right around the time she would have been freed up by no longer actually providing care to Helen and yet still collecting payments from me. She had created, in other words, a second income stream. Our money for nothing. 11 days after I came home to that dark house, and those cracked lips and that bone-dry glass on the counter, Kyle called and asked if he and Pam could come for Sunday dinner. I said of course. I said I'd make the pot roast. Helen always requests. I said how nice it would be to all sit together. I spent Saturday making the pot roast and cleaning the house and making a few quiet phone calls. They arrived at 5 o'clock. Kyle brought a bottle of Niagara Red, the kind he always brings because he knows I like it. Pam had her hair done. She hugged me at the door and told me I looked tired and asked how Helen was recovering. "Better every day," I said. We sat down. I poured the wine. I let the conversation run for about 20 minutes. How was work? How was the mine? Did they hear about the snowstorm coming Thursday? And then I set my fork down, and I reached under my chair for the folder I'd placed there before they arrived. I slid it across the table to the middle between the pot roast and the wine. Kyle looked at it. Pam looked at me. "I want to talk about my wife," I said. There was a knock at the door before Kyle could speak. He startled. I stood up, walked to the front door, and let in the detective and her colleague, who had been parked at the end of my street for the past 2 hours. I stepped aside and let them do their work. I watched Pam's face as the detective introduced herself. I want to say I felt something: satisfaction, anger, grief, something clean and nameable. What I actually felt was tired, deeply, thoroughly tired. And underneath the tired, a small, clear flame that I can only describe as certainty, the certainty that what I was doing was correct. Kyle said my name once, in a voice I hadn't heard since he was a teenager and had broken something valuable and was trying to calculate his way out of it. I looked at him. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the folder on the table hadn't already said. Pam was charged with fraud over $5,000, criminal negligence causing bodily harm, and theft by conversion under the criminal code. Kyle was charged as a party to the fraud. Both of them were released on conditions including a no-contact order, meaning neither of them could reach out to me or to Helen without going back in front of a judge. Beverly filed a civil suit the following week to recover the money. I hired a proper home care agency, real, vetted background check nurses who keep records and who answer to someone other than my son. Helen came home from the hospital 3 weeks after I found her. And on the day I brought her through the front door, I had the house warm and her favorite soup on the stove, and Gloria sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea waiting. Helen stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the kitchen, the light on, the soup steam, Gloria waving from the table, and she said quietly, "This is nice." I thought about the cracked lips and the dry glass on the counter, and the open door letting in the November cold, and I agreed with her. The case took 14 months to work through the courts. Pam pleaded guilty to the fraud charges and to a reduced negligence charge. Kyle pleaded guilty to being a party to fraud. Both received sentences that included significant fines, community service, and a period of probation. The Crown pushed for more. Beverly made sure every cent of what was taken from us was calculated into the civil judgment, and we received an order for repayment that, honestly, I expect to be fighting to collect for years. But the order exists. A few people have asked me whether I've forgiven my son. My sister asked me directly at Christmas last year, and I thought about it seriously before I answered her. I said, I hope he becomes someone worth forgiving. Right now, I don't know that man. The person who sat across my dinner table and brought the Niagara Red and made small talk while his mother was recovering in the hospital from what he had allowed to happen. I don't know who that person is. I made a son, and somewhere along the way, somebody else got made instead. Maybe that grief never fully resolves. I don't know yet. What I know is this. Helen is sitting in the sunroom right now as I write this. It's March. The snow is coming off the roof in chunks, the way it does when the temperature finally shifts, and the light is coming through the glass at that low angle. That means something warm is on its way. She has a cup of tea. She has her medication, taken at the right time, by someone who knows what they're doing. She has a garden to look forward to. I didn't scream when I found her that night. I didn't throw anything or fall apart. I did what needed to be done, step by step, until it was done. Some people, when I tell them this story, want to know if it was worth it. All the legal process, the months of paperwork, the family torn apart. I look at the woman in the sunroom and the question doesn't make any sense to me at all. There's a moment, somewhere in the middle of all of it, when I'm standing at the kitchen sink running cold water and looking out at the backyard, and I think, how did we get here? Not as an accusation, just as a genuine question a person asks themselves when the ground has shifted underneath everything they thought was solid. What Kyle and Pam didn't happen overnight. That's the part people don't always understand when I tell this story. It was built slowly, one small decision at a time. A canceled callback here, a forged phone number there, a text sent at 8 in the morning to make it look like someone cared. Each piece was small enough that you could almost miss it. But the pieces added up. And I think that's how people who do this kind of thing convince themselves it's manageable. They never look at the whole picture at once. They just take the next small step, and the next one, and they tell themselves it's fine. The consequence was the same whether they looked at the whole picture or not. I've thought a lot about what actually went wrong, not just legally, not just morally, but somewhere deeper. Because Kyle wasn't a bad child. I want to be honest about that. He was curious and funny, and he had a good heart when he was young. Something changed. Whether it was the relationship, the money, the slow erosion of caring about something beyond what was immediately convenient, I don't know. But somewhere along the way, he stopped doing the harder thing. He chose the easier path every single time, and after enough of those choices, the easier path was to let his mother go without water in a locked house while he went about his day. That's what happens when you stop practicing integrity, when it costs you nothing. By the time it costs you something real, you've lost the habit entirely. What I had, that Tuesday night when the Uber pulled in and the door was open and the house was dark, was the habit of doing the next right thing. Not because I'm exceptional, because I'd been doing it for 40 years in small, unremarkable ways, and it had become what I knew how to do. I pulled the bank records. I called the lawyer. I kept my voice level when I talked to my son. I didn't act until I had everything in order, and then I acted. That's not bravery. That's just what it looks like when someone has spent a long time keeping their head clear and their word good. The hardest part wasn't confronting them at the dinner table. The hardest part was the weeks between finding Helen and that Sunday dinner, holding everything I knew, going about normal life, not tipping my hand. That required something I can only describe as a kind of disciplined endurance. Knowing when to be patient is not a passive thing. It takes as much out of you as acting does. Helen is doing well now. The garden came back this spring better than last year. She's stubborn in the best possible way, and she is surrounded by people who show up. I don't spend much time thinking about whether Kyle will change. That's his work to do, not mine. What I know is that the people who endure, not just survive but actually come through something intact, are the ones who stayed honest with themselves about what was happening, thought carefully before they moved, and then didn't quit when it got difficult. Those three things together, not one of them alone. That's all I've got. It was enough.